When engineers inspect old bridges, they usually look up. They study the arches, the stonework, the iron spans, the elegant railings that have carried people across rivers for centuries. That is the part history likes to show. But the real mystery begins below the waterline. Because every so often, when rivers fall far enough during drought, when dams lower the flow, when channels are diverted, or when major maintenance forces the water back, something else appears. Not just footings, not just masonry sunk into mud, but foundations so deep, so ornate, and so disproportionate to the bridges above them that they begin to suggest a possibility most official histories are not prepared to entertain. What if many of the bridges we think we understand are only the visible tops of something much older? What if the rivers came later? Across Europe and North America, periods of extreme low water have exposed structures that were never meant to be seen again. Engineers working on dewatering projects, river diversions, hydroelectric maintenance, and drought-related inspections have occasionally found bridge foundations descending far below any depth recorded in the original specifications. Not a few feet deeper, not even a little deeper, dozens of meters deeper. And the further down they go, the stranger they become. Because what appears beneath many of these bridges does not behave like ordinary submerged infrastructure. It does not look like rough, buried masonry. It does not look like utilitarian support work executed under desperate conditions. It does not look like the kind of hidden stonework builders would create for something no one would ever see. Instead, it often looks finished, decorated, measured, as though the lower portions of these structures were built in the open air, as though they once stood fully above ground in a world that no longer exists. The official purpose of these inspections is always practical: lower the water, assess the piers, check for scour, examine structural fatigue, confirm whether old bridges need reinforcement before the next flood season or maintenance cycle. In theory, it is routine work. Engineers measure photograph core, the sediment, and move on. But routine work becomes something else when the river gives way. Because once the water drops below historical minimums, the visible bridge is no longer the whole bridge. That is when the contradictions begin. Inspection crews in multiple countries have described pier foundations extending 40, 50, even 60 meters below the riverbed. Let that sink in for a moment. Bridges historically recorded as spanning rivers that were never documented as being anywhere near that deep are found to rest on supports descending into depths that make no engineering sense within the accepted timeline. And it is not just the depth, it is what appears at that depth. Carved stone, cornices, decorative moldings, architectural details cut with the same care as the visible sections above water. In some cases, sculpted forms and ornamental features appear 30 meters below the modern riverbed, preserved beneath layers of mud and silt, where, according to every practical explanation, they should never have been placed in the first place. No engineer decorates what no one will see. No builder commissions refined stonework for sections meant to be buried forever in wet sediment. Not at that scale, not with that consistency. And yet that is exactly what some of these low water exposures appear to show. At first, crews tried to explain it away. Perhaps the rivers were lower during construction. Perhaps unusual drought conditions allowed deeper foundations. Perhaps cofferdams extended far below what the surviving records describe. Perhaps the apparent depth was exaggerated by erosion sediment displacement or measurement error. Those explanations sound reasonable until the pattern repeats. Because this is not one bridge, not one river, not one isolated anomaly in a place with poor records and an overactive imagination. The same impossibilities begin appearing again and again. Along the Rhine, along the Danube, along the Thames, along the Mississippi, along the Ohio, across regions separated by thousands of kilometers. Different empires, different engineers, different centuries, and supposedly different construction traditions. And still the same unsettling clues return. Foundations too deep for the recorded rivers. Stonework too ornate for submerged supports. Architectural proportions too deliberate for buried utility. Massive lower structures that seem built for something much larger than the bridges standing above them now. That is when the question changes. This is no longer only about bridge maintenance. It becomes a question about whether the visible bridges are merely the surviving upper portions of structures built in a very different landscape. One of the first major anomalies noted by inspectors was ornamentation, not rough blockwork, not plain structural stone. Ornamentation, decorative courses, carved moldings, refined surfaces continuing downward well past the point where any rational construction logic says the foundation should have turned purely functional. Some piers display the same architectural vocabulary below the waterline as above it, as though the structure never expected a river to exist at that height or at all. That is the part that is hardest to explain within conventional engineering history. Because foundation logic is brutally practical. The visible portion of a bridge may be beautiful, but the hidden portion is where beauty usually ends. Underground and underwater construction is expensive, dangerous, and technically difficult. Builders simplify it wherever they can. They do not waste time carving flourishes onto submerged masonry. They do not maintain aesthetic continuity through 30 or 40 meters of buried support unless that lower section was once intended to be seen. And if it was intended to be seen, then the modern river level cannot be the original ground level. The deeper inspections went, the more troubling the pattern became. Below what engineers expected to be the base of the pier, they often found continuation. Not a rough footing spreading into mud, but the further descent of the same structural language. Larger columns, more refined joinery. In some cases, arch-like cavities and chambered volumes with geometry too careful to dismiss as random voids. These lower elements do not look like temporary construction aids. They look permanent, as though they belong to a monumental design partially swallowed by the earth. That alone would be enough to unsettle the accepted story. But there is a second problem, and it may be even worse. The construction itself should have been nearly impossible. Modern deep river bridge building requires enormous resources, massive coffer dams, pumping systems, temporary diversions, labor forces, materials, planning, detailed records. The deeper the construction, the more evidence such operations leave behind. Entire industries are required to create dry working conditions in which deep masonry can even begin. And yet for many of these bridges, the historical documentation does not even come close to describing the scale of work that would have been necessary to build at the depths now being observed. No detailed records of coffer dams descending 40 meters. No documentation of giant pumping installations. No accounts of river diversions on the scale the foundations would require. No material ledgers reflecting construction burdens of that magnitude. No surviving engineering discussions commensurate with the technical challenge. That silence matters. Because if the lower structures really were built during the documented bridge projects, then their construction should have been remembered as extraordinary. It should have been celebrated, recorded in obsessive technical detail, engineers would have pointed to it as a masterpiece. Instead, the lower depths are often either missing generalized or rendered as shallow footings in later diagrams. That is not what you expect when the hidden section of a bridge is one of the greatest engineering achievements of its age. It is what you expect when the hidden section belongs to a story no one wants to tell clearly. As inspection teams gathered footage and measurements, some began describing the foundations in private or restricted technical language as anomalous construction, disproportionate infrastructure, or inconsistent with documented specifications. Those phrases are careful. These are too careful. They reveal the same pattern that appears in so many buried history cases. Something visible enough to disturb the observers, but described in language cautious enough to avoid confronting the full implication. And the implication is impossible to ignore. These do not look like foundations sized only for the bridges above them. Many look too large, far too large. Some pier bases are broad enough to suggest supports for structures vastly heavier than the spans that currently rest above them. Others include internal spaces and chamber-like voids that make little sense for simple load transfer. Some of the lower masses seem proportioned almost as if they once carried monumental superstructures, cathedral-scale loads towers, or elevated systems no longer present. Inspection engineers reportedly described some of them as disproportionate infrastructure. That is a telling phrase. Not merely oversized for safety, oversized for purpose, built for something that does not exist anymore. And that leads to one of the most unsettling possibilities in the entire pattern. What if many bridges were not originally built across rivers at all? What if they were built across dry valleys, broad depressions, or terrestrial corridors in a landscape where the water was either far lower or absent entirely? What if what we now call river bridges are actually the upper remnants of a pre-existing transportation or ceremonial network, later buried, inundated, and partially repurposed? That sounds extreme until the geology enters the picture. Because the deeper some inspections went, the less the surrounding sediment behaved like slowly accumulated river mud. Core samples around certain foundations reportedly revealed rapid deposition layers, strange flow signatures, and in some cases, organic remains more consistent with terrestrial environments than long-term aquatic ones. Root structures, soil horizons, fossilized vegetation traces in positions that suggest the foundations once stood in dry ground before being buried under enormous volumes of sediment and waterborne material. Again, any one case could be dismissed. But when similar anomalies appear across multiple rivers and across multiple continents, the burden shifts. This is not random local flooding. It is not one unusual bridge. It is not one eccentric survey team seeing patterns where none exist. It begins to look like a repeated geological memory, a memory of a different landscape, a memory of a rapid transformation rather than a slow one. And if that is true, then the deepest parts of these bridges are not merely hidden construction. They are evidence of burial. Evidence that river systems, sediment levels, and modern water lines may not reflect the environment in which many of these structures were originally built. This is where the official explanations become noticeably weaker. Sediment accumulation, localized erosion, forgotten renovations, historical mismeasurement. These can explain slight discrepancies. They cannot explain decorative stonework 40 meters down. They cannot explain chambered lower sections with finished geometry. They cannot explain how multiple bridges in multiple countries across different eras end up expressing the same strange contradiction between visible history and submerged reality. And the contradiction gets worse, because the lower you go, the more the craftsmanship often improves rather than deteriorates. Surfaces remain precise, joints remain clean, architectural language remains coherent. This is the opposite of what one would expect from emergency or hidden support work. It looks less like difficult underwater construction and more like leisurely monumental masonry executed in open air by builders unconcerned with concealment. That detail is devastating to the conventional timeline, because if the lower sections were built in the open air, then the modern rivers came later, or the ground level was dramatically higher when the structures were built. Either way, the bridge as we know it becomes only the surviving visible fraction of something far older and far larger. That possibility explains many things at once. It explains why the lower ornamentation exists. It explains why the depths make no sense. It explains why the foundations seem oversized. It explains why the documentation is so evasive. It explains why so many bridges appear to be inherited structures rather than purely original works of their recorded eras. Builders may not have created the entire thing from scratch. They may have adapted what was already there. Raised decks, repaired upper spans, recut visible sections, reused older supports whose true depth and original context had already been forgotten or quietly ignored. That would also explain why historical records often feel incomplete, why the visible bridge receives attention while the hidden foundation dissolves into vagueness. Later engineers may have known enough to use the structure, but not enough to explain it. Or they may have known exactly how strange it was and understood that a full explanation would destabilize the accepted story of recent history. As water levels fell during major droughts and maintenance operations, some of these structures briefly came back into view. Engineers filmed them, surveyed them, measured what they could, but the investigations by many accounts never reached their logical conclusion. That part matters, because the inspections did not end in clarity, they ended in interruption. Water returned, access was restricted, budgets shifted, priorities changed, deep zones were left unexamined. Officially, that sounds mundane. Infrastructure agencies are not archaeological institutes. They do not have time to unravel historical mysteries when bridges still need to carry traffic and rivers still need to flow. But once again, a pattern emerges inside that practical explanation. The shallow, conventional parts of the inspections continued. The deepest, strangest, most historically disruptive sections remained the least resolved. The most anomalous foundations were often the ones that vanished back beneath the water without comprehensive surveying. The most elaborate lower carvings were resubmerged. The most puzzling geological contexts were left suspended in ambiguity. And when water levels normalized, public attention moved on. That is how uncomfortable history survives. Not by being disproven, by being drowned again, by being filed away, by being deferred, by becoming someone else's problem in another budget cycle, another drought, another century. What remains are fragments, a handful of reports, some photographs, technical notes, private correspondence. The testimony of inspectors who saw something that did not fit the bridge they thought they were examining. From those fragments, a larger pattern begins to form, a network of crossings across Europe and North America, whose lower structures appear too deep, too ornate, too geologically inconsistent, and too massively proportioned for the rivers they now span. A network that looks less like a series of isolated engineering projects and more like the surviving upper layer of a broader infrastructural world. A world built for a different ground level. A world built before the waters came. The most haunting possibility is not simply that one bridge or another has a strange foundation. It is that the pattern suggests coordination, similar dimensions, similar construction habits, similar aesthetic continuity between visible and buried sections, similar evidence of water or sediment arriving after the structures were already in place. That begins to sound less like local history and more like civilizational memory. Perhaps these were not just bridges in the narrow modern sense. Perhaps they were part of a larger continental system of routes crossings, elevated corridors, or ceremonial ways connecting settlements across a landscape later transformed by flood sediment and the rivers we now take for granted as permanent. If that sounds speculative, it is. But it is speculation forced by the structures themselves. The visible evidence pulls the mind in that direction, because the official narrative stops short of answering the questions the stone keeps asking. Why decorate what no one would ever see? Why build deeper than your technology could realistically support? Why leave no records of the extraordinary operations such construction would require? Why do the lower sections look open air and monumental rather than buried and practical? Why do the foundations seem made for a world larger than the bridges now standing on them? And why, when low water finally exposes the contradictions, do the investigations end before the deepest answers are reached? Because if the deepest sections were fully documented, fully drained, fully mapped, fully cored, fully excavated, the implications might become much harder to contain. Entire river histories would need revisiting. Entire engineering chronologies would need revision. The story of how landscapes changed, how infrastructure was inherited, and how recent some of those changes may have been, could no longer be treated as settled. That is why the silence after these discoveries matters as much as the discoveries themselves. The water rises, the foundations disappear, the reports shorten, the mystery remains. And somewhere beneath the rivers, those structures continue to stand. Not gone, not disproven, just submerged, waiting for the next drought, the next diversion, the next maintenance window when the water briefly pulls back and reveals a little more of the impossible. If even part of this pattern is real, then many of the grand bridges we admire today are not entirely what we think they are. They are not simply masterpieces spanning rivers in the ordinary course of recorded history. They may be the surviving crowns of structures built for a different earth, a different topography, a different age of construction than buried, drowned, and repurposed by the world that followed. And if that is true, then the real question is no longer about bridge engineering. It is about the landscape itself. What if today's rivers are the aftermath, not the origin? What if many valleys were filled rapidly, not gradually? What if the water did not merely flow around these structures, but arrived after they were built? And if the bridges are older than the rivers they cross, then what else beneath the modern world was built? Before the waters changed course, what other foundations wait below reservoirs, harbors, and drowned cities? What other infrastructure is hiding beneath the line, where engineers stop measuring and history stops asking? What other pieces of the world we know are only the exposed tops of something much larger, much older, and much more difficult to explain? The bridge inspections were never supposed to reveal any of that. They were meant to check load scour and erosion. Instead, for a few brief moments, they may have revealed another map beneath the visible one. A lower map, A buried map. A map of arches, piers, chambers, and stonework built before the rivers rose high enough to hide them. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all, that the next time you stand on an old bridge and look down at the water below, you may not be looking at the environment it was built for. You may be looking at the thing that buried it. If this stayed with you, there are more river cities and submerged structures where the truth may still be waiting below the waterline.